Hello and welcome back, everybody. In this lecture, we're going to be exploring the work of a very controversial individual in the field of psychology, a gentleman that you've probably heard of long before you took this class, somebody named Sigmund Freud. In this lecture, we're going to detail some of his ideas, some of his concepts, and a lot of the twists and turns that occurred during his attempts to really reshape certain areas of psychology that really didn't exist before his work started. To understand what we're going to be looking at with respect to Sigmund Freud, I wanted to just point out some of the nuances to him that made him such a critical figure within the field. We're going to be looking at not only his history, but a lot of the things that he challenged and questions that he produced when he started to push some of his very controversial ideas about what we call personality psychology and clinical psychology, the two areas that we're going to be focusing on really for the remainder of this semester. Before we talk about all those ideas, I always need to start when discussing Freud with a cautionary note. And that's the fact that even though we're going to be treating a lot of the terms and concepts that he talks about as kind of established things within the field of psychology, there are a lot of individuals that feel strongly that Sigmund Freud and his approach to the mind and his unscientific rigor that he used to try to understand it caused a lot of problems and harm to the field of psychology as a whole. In essence, before Freud, psychology was a science that was studying very basic processes in its attempts to be scientific, to align itself with biology or chemistry or any of the other very hard sciences at the time. Freud took this idea and transitioned it into kind of a pseudo field with lots of hypothetical things that could potentially be explored and things that made it exciting, but not necessarily things that allowed it to stay rooted in the scientific upbringings that it had established over the first century or so, well, maybe not century, but half century or so of work as psychology started to grow. So in this lecture, we're not only going to cover his terms, but we're going to look at the point of his work, how it was established, and how it really did shift our discussion on the branches of personality and clinical psychology as a whole. So who was Sigmund Freud? Sigmund Freud was born in an area that's now a part of Austria in 1856. Most of his childhood was actually spent in Austria as well, and he eventually earned his Doctor of Medicine in 1881, if you're doing the math, at the age of about 25. And most of his focus when earning his Doctor of Medicine in Austria was on this new movement that had started to swell up in medicine called the psychodynamic movement, championed by a theorist named Ernst Wilhelm Ritter von Brucke. Very long name, very broad idea. But if we want to whittle this psychodynamic idea down, just understand that it was kind of this notion that all of our biological functions were the things that dictated how the mind and other things worked. So if we were, say, hungry, it was not just this random passing thought. It was the byproduct of certain cells within, say, our stomach or other parts communicating with other systems and eventually sending this message to our brain that got us to feel that hunger. If we were tired, it wasn't just some random thing that hit us, it was a byproduct of cells communicating with each other in a way that got the brain eventually, or mind eventually, to realize that we were tired. This was something that they applied to pretty much every aspect of our human experience, and it was something that really resonated with Freud as he got his Doctor of Medicine and started trying to help patients with a wide range of different issues relating to pain. Most of his work focused on individuals that were experiencing persistent pain and trying to find a source or a cure for that persistent pain that they were experiencing. This led Freud to dabble in a number of different approaches, including drugs and exploration of different types of techniques that had been invented over the years to try to help his patients or his clients try to overcome some of this persistent pain that they'd suffered with for years. And eventually, collaborating with another theorist named Jean Charcot, he started experimenting with something that you might learn about later called hypnosis, it's kind of induced state of consciousness, and trying to explore how putting people in this odd state of consciousness might be a way, a pathway into helping these individuals. With his work with drugs as well and other things that he started to explore, it eventually led Freud down the path to coming to the conclusion that maybe a lot of people's pain and the way to access their issues was derived through tapping into this hidden mind that was theoretically evoked during hypnosis or the use of specific types of drugs. And it eventually led to his ideas of how this psychodynamic movement could be applied to psychology and could kind of be integrated in a way that highlighted this interaction between our mind and our physical world. This idea started to pick up steam in Vienna, Austria, and other places, but it wasn't until it started to become embraced in the United States that Freud gained a lot of popularity and was able to establish a very still existent and kind of popular school called the Psychodynamic Institute in Vienna. This place where people can go and study this psychodynamic movement that Freud was kind of ever changing and introducing over the span of his career. So what was this psychodynamic theory? As we talked about before, the psychodynamic theory of Freud's really came from the psychodynamic movement in medicine. Freud made it unique in that his focus was on not just how pain and hunger and all of these basic responses could be linked to biology, but also how individual differences and mental health issues could also potentially be linked to biological things and kind of the interplay between the mind and the brain and the body. This psychodynamic movement was expanded upon when he again started to explore this idea of the unconscious and suggest that maybe a lot of the different things that were triggering pain or depression or other things could not just be coming from conscious thoughts and ideas that we have on the surface, but through this inner hidden world within us that he called the unconscious. And as his popularity started to grow and people started to try to understand what it was he was looking at, Freud went on to expand upon the difference between the conscious and unconscious and introduced some still very persistent and popular topics that we have around today. When separating out the conscious and unconscious, Freud often talked about the difference between what he called the ego and the id. He argued that our ego was this kind of mind that we had operating on the surface. It contained all the thoughts and emotions and experiences that we had and could articulate to others. But he said hidden underneath this ego was this huge motivating unconscious force that was driven primarily by urges, kind of carnal urges like a need for sex and survival and food and essentially all of these basic things that keep us alive, but maybe aren't necessarily things that help society as a whole. Freud argued that our id was what we all started as. When we're born, we're just this need-based thing that's doing everything in its power to try to provide us with all the things that we need. And he said as we age, we start to recognize that sometimes pursuing these things for the id are not socially approved. And he said this eventually develops this new thing that he called a part of our preconscious called the superego, where we start to learn what it is that society expects of us, what it means to behave appropriately in specific situations. And he said this superego is often in conflict with the id. And because of it, this new thing on the surface, this conscious thing called the ego, starts to develop. And as we get older, the ego is constantly operating on this thing called the reality principle. And this attempt to balance the needs of the ids with the kind of expectations of the superego that we have. And as we display different behaviors, we might come up with different rationales for what we're doing, but he surmised that a large portion of what we were doing at any given moment, a large number of individual differences and mental health issues, were really a byproduct of what was happening below the surface. in this battle between the id and the superego to try to move us, sway us to do certain things in our everyday encounters. As I mentioned before, when we look at Freud's theory a little bit more, what we see is something that can actually be tethered to two different branches of psychology. His early idea of the psychodynamic approach was the seedlings for growth in the clinical psychology world that we have today. There's lots of individuals that vehemently disagree with a lot of the assumptions that Freud had, but his notion of mental things impacting our mental health was relatively novel at the time. And as he introduced his ideas, people came up with counters and different ways to study clinical psychology in ways that eventually led to the formation of clinical psych as a whole. His theories also were critical in our first steps to understanding what we call personality psychology, where individual differences come from. His focus was on our critical things that pushed us in different directions, not how we could necessarily quantify those or how they impacted us. But his early work, and this psychodynamic approach, is again considered by many to be the seeds that eventually led to the growth of this new branch of psychology that wasn't around at the time called personality psychology. For Freud, for looking at his clinical work, what we need to recognize is that not only did he try to explain where some of our mental health issues were coming from, but he also tried to find ways to fix it through other techniques that he, again, collaborated with others to try to establish. His hypnotic approach, or his approach to using hypnosis, is something that he's often tied to, is kind of the key theme to what he tried to do to help many individuals with a litany of different problems. But if we look closer at Freud's work, what we see is that his approach, his psychoanalytic approach, actually involved a large range of different things. Most of his work eventually evolved into exploring the childhoods of individuals, the pasts of people, the things that they don't necessarily want to talk about, but could be pushing them in different directions. And we call this type of therapeutic intervention or kind of interaction psychoanalysis. Psychoanalysis also has different things, tricks within them that were introduced or at least championed by Freud. One of the things that he pushed was this idea of something called free association tasks, where he'd give individuals a long list of words and have them either rattle off the first word that came to mind when they'd hear these lists, or go off on listing as many words as they could come up with as they were talking to a therapist to see if any of these things could start to bring up persistent themes, suggesting that maybe if a certain theme came up over and over again, that it might be something linked to the unconscious that was sort of peaking up because of this technique. This is also something he tried to do through something called dream interpretation, where he would ask individuals to write down their dreams, and he could theoretically decode them through this technique that he devised after years of, we'll call it research. This dream interpretation approach of his actually led to him becoming extremely famous and popular around the world when he published in 1919 a book entitled The Interpretation of Dreams. It's something that is still technically in circulation today, and it led to some of the more unusual dream interpretation approaches that people still do today when they write down dream journals and try to look up the meaning of some consistent dreams that many of us have. It also led to Freud's introduction of this thing that we nowadays call Freudian slips. These slips of the tongue where we theoretically have our unconscious come to the surface and get us to say something that we swear we didn't intend to say, but seems to have a lot of meaning behind it. A classic example of this is if we see a friend we haven't seen in a long time and we say, "I'm so sad to see you," instead of "I'm so glad to see you," like we thought we intended to do. Now, please understand that there's not necessarily a lot of research or rigorous merit behind a lot of these approaches, but these things that Freud introduced were always devised by him as a way to get at the unconscious, and again, they were the seedlings for the growth of clinical psychology as the field started to blossom and start to look at the mental world linked to different mental health issues that people were struggling with. If we're looking closer at some of the things that this psychodynamic approach tried to tap into, as I mentioned, a lot of the things that he focused on was our childhood and our past. And that's because, according to Freud and his work, most of our issues that we have as adults stem from things that we experienced in our childhood. Some of these things could be trauma-based, or things that led us to conclude about the world in ways that was unhealthy. But a lot of it, according to Freud, was sexual in nature. Either we'd experienced some type of sexual trauma or experienced some type of sexual frustration at a young age that carried over and manifested itself in unusual, quirky behaviors that we often didn't like. And to explain this idea further, as Freud advanced, he started to develop this model, this theory of psychosexual development that he pushed on people in the latter years of his career. He surmised, after we can again call it research, that most of us are very sexual individuals, and a lot of us are controlled by this thing that he called libido. As adults, that sexual energy is usually manifested in some type of physical sexual drive. But as children, or sexual individuals, it's just the thing we focus on. The psychosexual energy that we have actually moves to different places. And when we derive pleasure from these different places, sometimes he called them orifices, then we get the same gratification that we get as adults through sex, just kind of in a different psychological way. He argued that when we're born, our psychosexual energy is focused on our mouths, where being able to chew on things, suck on things, get sustenance through getting stuff into our mouth is the primary goal. He contended that most of us are constantly seeking out sexual gratification by eating and chewing on everything, and if we get all of that taken care of in the first year to year and a half of our life, then we just move on and transition to another stage of psychosexual development. But if we don't, if, say, we're not given the bottle quite enough, or we don't get to chew on everything in front of us, he contended that this might develop into some of the first psychosexual problems, which he linked to something that he called oral fixations. He suggested in his, again, very rigorous research-based ideas, I'm being sarcastic if you didn't catch that, that chewing gum, needing to smoke cigarettes, constantly gnawing on your pencils, or overeating, or maybe even trying to control how much food you get into your mouth, could actually be a byproduct of this kind of oral fixation that you developed during the oral stage. In the anal stage, the next stage that he proposed we went through, he said that most of us focus our attention now on potty training, the ability to control our bowel and bladder movements. He suggested for us, if we can hold it and go to the bathroom when we want, we could derive a lot of pleasure through that specific experience. If we, however, encountered lots of conflict at this time, or we weren't able to do what we were trying to do, this could eventually result in other fixations, other problems. One of them he called anal retentiveness, where when we don't get to control those things at a young age, start to obsess about controlling things at other ages. Some of you might have actually used this term at some point in your life. If you've told somebody when they look at your really nicely cleaned room or your perfectly organized notebook that you're kind of anal about that, which you maybe unwittingly were doing in this statement, is saying that you had some potty training issues when you were a young child, and now it manifests itself in you needing to have some type of organization in your room or your book. Don't sweat it if you are that way. There's very little research to give any support to this idea of Freud's, much like many of his concepts. But Freud nonetheless did introduce this, and it became a part of our everyday conversation. Another stage that he highlighted, which was one that was filled with lots of controversy, was this stage called the phallic stage, where he said at around 3, boys and girls start to recognize gender, start to separate themselves, and start to focus their attention on the genitals and other sexual organs that are critical for us to kind of differentiate between the genders that exist. He suggested that many girls at around the age of 3, when they realize they don't have this thing called a penis, start to develop something that will persist with them throughout their lives called penis envy. This kind of jealousy of males that they don't have the ability to, well, I guess procreate. I don't know why that would be something that would create this envy, but he suggested that this causes this angst and this constant feeling of inability to be equal to the male counterparts. He also suggested that for males, this was a pretty tumultuous time because for them, once they realized they had something that a big portion of the population didn't have, they started to worry that that thing might eventually be taken away from them, either cut off or just disappear at some point. And this eventually evolves for both genders into this intensification into the gender that most people are a part of, or potentially this kind of crossing over around genders at this age as people start to really focus their attention on gender and potentially the possibility of engaging in some type of a relationship with a member of the opposite gender. I'm sure that Freud had a couple people that were interested in people of the same gender, but this was something that he very rarely explored when talking about his work and in particular this phallic stage. Now, for those of you that are a little upset with this stage, please understand again that there's not much research to support that we go through this, and there's very little research to suggest that at around age 3, all girls immediately develop penis envy and are forever envious of males for the rest of their life. And in fact, if you want an interesting twist on this, know that when Freud retired, his daughter Anna Freud and one of her colleagues, a woman named Karen Horney, introduced a concept called womb envy, which was sort of a slight to Freud, wherein they suggested that during the phallic stage, the biggest thing that happened is males start to realize that they don't have wombs, can't bear children, and therefore are envious of women for the rest of their life, constantly trying to put them down. I'm not sure there's much research behind that idea of Horny's and Anna Freud's, but it really highlights how a lot of this was literally just theory. Ideas about how our childhood could carry over into our adulthood and cause these residual effects. Now, Freud did talk about how from about 6 to puberty we were in this thing called a latency phase, and then when we became adults, got through puberty, sex and all the things that come with it started to hit us hard, and we started to have lots of issues revolving around basic everyday sex topics. And this concept of Freud's, again, was just a small portion of what he was interested in, but it started this very elaborate, controversial argument around where mental health issues could come from and why childhood was so unbelievably important. Now, I'm guessing many of you might be sitting there right now thinking to yourself, where did all of this come from? How did these ideas come about in the first place? Where did these models of psychosexual stages of development and these concepts of the unconscious and conscious develop from? It might seem like this was sort of a random thing, but you have to understand, historically, again, a lot of his early inklings were coming from this psychodynamic movement that was picking up in the mid-1800s. It was also coming from some of his random interactions with his early clients, and eventually it came from some of his just basic personal insights that he started to develop and test with the population to see what stuck. For Freud, there was no need to explore lots of concepts and ideas with the scientific rigor that every one of his fellow psychologists were using to try to understand different aspects of the human mind. Freud contended that if something seemed to make sense and it stuck and it sort of worked for certain people, that it should be pushed as fact, even if that fact had to be adjusted. So most of his theories and work and his approaches to helping individuals were sort of catered to the person and were based off of his own insights and ideas that were oftentimes coming from the drug-induced states that Freud himself was going through as a result of his very heavy addiction to cocaine in the latter portions of his career. For those of you judging Freud because of his cocaine use, please understand that he was part of a different era. Freud used cocaine a lot, primarily as a way to try to help him with his own persistent pain that he was experiencing. Cocaine was not necessarily a celebrated way of dealing with chronic pain, but it was a common thing that was prescribed to individuals who were struggling with chronic pain and couldn't find any solution to it. Unfortunately, as we know today, cocaine has quite the impact on the mind, and many people think that a lot of his more controversial and elaborate personal insights came as a byproduct of his cocaine-induced states that he was constantly going through on a regular basis. We're looking for the other source of a lot of his theories, though. It is important to note that he continued to try to practice throughout most of his career and insisted that a lot of the terms and ideas he came up with were a byproduct of the people he was seeing, what we nowadays call case studies. One of his more famous clients that he saw and was constantly referencing in his talks and books was a woman named Anna O, who, for some miraculous reason, had almost every malady you could possibly imagine at some point in her life. Freud, in his talks, would explain something that would happen to this woman that he called Anna, and how he would dive into some aspect of her experiences or her childhood or something that was occurring at the time, find a source for that problem, get her to rethink about it, or get her to address it in a specific way, and magically, within a matter of minutes, that malady that she had struggled with for a while would disappear. Now, if we're looking for some interesting historical context, know that there's a lot of people that believe that Anna O was a real, actual person, a woman named Bertha Pappenheim. I also know that there's a lot of research to suggest that most of the stories that Freud told about Anna were entirely made up. In fact, most of the stories that Freud told about many of his clients seem to have been entirely made up. Freud himself admitted that sometimes he embellished in a lot of these case studies because they would highlight his theories that he was convinced made sense, even if he didn't have any scientific proof for them actually making sense. And this was a big issue that people started to raise when it came to Freud and his growth in popularity. Not only was he shifting the conversation in clinical psych and personality psych, but he was shifting the approach of clinical psychologists and personality psychologists that were starting to come up at the time. He was getting them to find ways to explore ideas without doing it in the same scientific way that all of their psychology peers were doing at the time when they were exploring things like sensation and perception and memory and other things that we've discussed in the class thus far. And this is one of the big issues that people have complained about when it comes to Freud. His attempts to try to understand the human mind and these very controversial topics of clinical psychology and, I guess, an interesting topic of personality psychology were not based in science like we would like. There's also a lot of research to suggest that he did a lot of undue harm on individuals who were struggling with mental health issues or were kind of displaying weird behaviors by linking those things to psychosexual development and childhood traumas. In fact, there was a big backlash in the clinical community when we discovered that many families started hiding cases of schizophrenia, depression, other mental health issues because of Freud's insistence that people who struggled with these things obviously had experienced some type of childhood trauma at home. This made these mental health issues not just an indictment on the person, stigmatized them, but it also made an indictment on the family and all the different people that these individuals interacted with in their childhood and earlier years. This was kind of a persistent problem with Freud, and it still is kind of resonating in today's stigma surrounding clinical psychology that we'll talk about in future classes. Which might lead you to say, why do we celebrate Freud still then? Why do we even talk about him in an intro class? Well, what I want you to understand with Freud is, with all of his faults and all the things that I really wish he hadn't done. What he did was get the conversation started for both personality psychology and clinical psychology. Even if the conversation starter was, this guy's wrong, this is how things should work, or this is what we should do, nobody was talking about these things really in psychology before Freud. And what Freud did, in kind of a subtle way, was not only get the conversation started, but he transitioned lots of topics that were linked to biology, linked to medicine, over to the psychology field. We're going to talk in a couple classes about how the early years of clinical psychology were rooted in this notion that people who had mental health issues had essentially caught some bug, had something that was irreparably damaged, and you needed to just keep them away from individuals so they wouldn't spread their problems. Freud was one of the first people to suggest that this is not an accurate depiction of what's going on for people with mental health problems. Yes, he put the blame on something else, which is just as stigmatizing, childhood trauma and sexual abuse and other things, but his shift in the focus of mental health to talking about the childhood differences that kind of cause these things were really intriguing. And he did, for the first time, trigger this conversation and talking about where just day-to-day individual differences were coming from. You'll read in the book about these things called defense mechanisms that he said might shape individual differences that we see. You'll also read about how his work talked about kind of how, as we start to develop who we are, we look at the conflicts and the kind of components to us, that superego and id, to form this sense of self, this ego that we have. Whether or not the id and the superego exists is highly debatable, but at least we developed through the work of Freud some framework to build off of when personality psychology started to take shape in the early 1900s. He also, for giving him credit, did put an emphasis, much like Piaget and Binet and other people that we've talked about, on the importance of childhood. His suggestions, along with the work of lots of other developmental psychologists that we've talked about thus far, reshaped our perception of the importance of childhood. A couple centuries before, children really were considered these individuals we could just kind of lock up in a room and let them sit there until they grew and had the mental functioning to act as adults. Freud and others surmised that this is not the way we needed to handle the situation. If we wanted people to be healthy and have their minds function at their top peak, we needed to really provide enriched, healthy, safe environments for children. Again, there's stigma that comes along with some of the things that he talked about childhood, but he did get us to, again, pay attention to childhood in a way that we hadn't before. And if we're looking for one of the other things that he contributed on that realm, he did get the conversation about sex started. Lots of people just completely avoided that issue, talking about how it might impact our thinking and our daily behavior, and Freud really broke down that barrier. Maybe he led people to discuss it in ways that were very unscientific, but it eventually led to our current research on sexual identity and sex and the importance of it and how it does shape many aspects of our everyday behaviors and individual differences. And if we're looking for one last thing that we can sort of link to Freud, his notion of the unconscious at the time was completely novel. We nowadays in cognitive psychology talk about different levels of consciousness and how we experience things on these different levels. Of course, when we do that in cognitive psychology, there's usually this caveat of a flat rejection of Freud's notion of the unconscious containing these things called the id and the superego, and how these carnal urges are the things that push us. But the idea of implicit mental life, implicit motivation, and implicit memory, these things stemmed off of the ideas of Freud. And maybe we would have gotten there in a more scientific way even without Freud, but he did get the conversation started on this in a way that, if we're looking at his history and the field as a whole, we do have to kind of, I don't know if the word credit's right, but at least identify, he impacted. And this is, I think, a good place to stop. We've covered the history of Freud, some of his ideas, some of his big terms. There's more in the book as well on it. But hopefully, after you've listened to this lecture now, you have a better understanding of the context around Sigmund Freud, why he is such a monumental figure in the history of psychology, and also you have an understanding of where we're going to go from here. How once Freud started the conversation in both personality and clinical psych, others picked up that torch and moved it in different directions and eventually led to the formation of clinical psych and personality psych today that we'll be talking about in future classes. Please again remember, lots of the things we covered in this class are not scientific based. I don't want anybody calling their parents, asking about certain things because they chew too much gum or they like to have a neat notebook. Please avoid that temptation. Just take this at the surface level. Make sure you understand the content and the role it played in the formation of these branches of psychology. And if you do that, you're well equipped to move on. It's going to mark the end of today. Thank you very much for watching throughout. I'm sure I'll see many of you soon. Take care.